You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.
Welcome back to On the Way Home, the podcast that explores the challenges and opportunities shaping housing and homelessness in Canada. I'm your host, Emmy Kelly, and today I'm thrilled to welcome back a familiar and respected voice in our sector, Ray Sullivan, Executive Director of the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, or CHRA, as many will know. Ray has spent more than 25 years championing non-market and community housing across the country, and today we'll dive into the future of affordable housing, from federal policy shifts and Build Canada homes to the evolving balance between market and non-market supply and the research that's helping shape real-world change. Let's listen in. Hey Ray, thanks so much for returning to On the Way Home today.
Hi, Emmy. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
We'll start with our signature question. I know you've answered it before, but could you tell us what home means to you, or perhaps you could also build on what may have changed over time since you last answered it in that definition?
Yeah, home means everything to me. I'm so aware, like every day, that the privilege I enjoy in having a safe, secure, and affordable home. Like it's the foundation for everything in our lives, right? Like my family, my mental and physical health, my job, even. It's everything.
You have been working in nonprofit community housing now for over 25 years. Can you share a little bit about your journey, what first drew you into this field, and how you've seen the sector evolve during that time?
Yeah, and what an honor it has been to be a houser for the past 25 years and a bit, and like a lot of people get into this, it's the people, the privilege of knowing that I can contribute something that improves people's lives and livelihood and well-being. 25 years ago when I started this work, we were at a low point as a sector. We'd seen the withdrawal of the federal government and almost all of the provinces from investing in community housing. Pace that we were building new non-market community housing had dropped off cliff. And the impact of that is so painfully visible today, right? I mean, today's housing crisis is a direct result of yesterday's bad decisions 25, 30 years ago. And I mean, one thing that makes me optimistic is this is now widely acknowledged by all federal political parties that the federal government abandoning nonprofit housing in the 1990s is what led to the current housing and homelessness crisis. So, the feds came back 2017, 2018 with the National Housing Strategy, and it's a big deal. It hasn't fully realized its potential, and I hope we'll get a chance to talk about that a little bit later, but it's still a big deal. And it spurred this amazing renaissance in community housing. We've rapidly expanded our capacity to build and develop new housing. We're innovating on new sources of private capital and financing, going beyond what's on the table from governments. And we're much more sophisticated asset managers than we were 25 years ago. We've improved our ability to provide supports to tenants, but still not the resources that we need to do that the way that we want to and need to. In the past decade, we've seen this really strong consensus across the sector that we need to prioritize Indigenous-led community housing, for Indigenous, by Indigenous. And we're having these conversations about like scaling up both as organizations and as a sector as a whole. So yeah, like a lot of things have changed over the past 25 years, but everyone that I talk to is still motivated by that same thing that got almost all of us hooked on housing in the first place, making a positive impact on people's lives and well-being, making the world a better place. And as you know well, community housing does exactly that.
Would you say that's what's kept you going? Like, what has kept you going? When you said it was bad back then, I'm thinking we're in full-blown crisis mode now. Nothing is easy about creating this housing. I was out speaking the night before last, and it's as though people had kind of expected that we had created a magic performa that would allow us to create deeply affordable housing in perpetuity. And I was like, no, not a chance. There's nothing easy about this. If it was easy, we would have done it already. And so I'm thinking, it does get to be quite an uphill climb
Yeah.
for a leader in this space. What's kept you for 25 years?
And yeah, there is no magic formula. There is no magic wand when it comes to the systems change that we're working on. I mean, this just takes hard work day in and day out. But there is a magic formula when it comes to individual change in people's lives, and being able to see that, as I have many times in the past 20 years, to get to know people for whom affordable housing has made such a big difference in their lives. And having had the honor of working for one nonprofit for most of 20 years, um, to not only see people, find their footing, stabilize their lives, and prosper from there, but then get to know their kids when their kids find that same footing and get a chance to thrive and prosper. So those kinds of individual magic stories and seeing that impact keep me going and help me keep working on the bigger and harder systems level change.
It's amazing. Thank you, Ray. Now you're the executive director of the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, and you have been for a few years. What do you see as the biggest opportunities currently facing the non-market community housing sector?
Yeah, so CHRA, the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, we're the group that brings non-market community housing sector together, right? And as housers, we've got a lot of opportunities ahead of us. I saw a poll just a couple of weeks ago, that 9 out of 10 Canadians are concerned about failures in the housing system, and for good reason, right? Like over half of Canadian renters cannot afford the average asking rents. Over half of Canadians are worried that they might lose their own homes if their family is subject to some kind of financial shock. And with what's going on with our relationship with the US, there's financial shocks every second day, it seems. And when people are asked what's driving this, they understand, and the polls show this, they understand that it's a failure to build enough supply of affordable housing. And when people understand the role that nonprofit and co-op housing plays in the system, there's massive support for building more of that across the country. So it's a crisis, but it's also a big opportunity for systems change, and the support is there across the country. So CHRA has put up the challenge that we need to more than double the percentage of community housing in the next decade, and then work toward 20% after that. And there's a real growing consensus around that idea, right? When Mark Carney was running for leadership of the Federal Liberal Party, he called for doubling the supply of community housing. And I saved a copy of that website, so I've kept the receipts, and we can go back to that one day. But we also see the same kind of priority reflected in the launch of Build Canada Homes a couple of months ago.
Thanks. That's an awesome segue. I was going to say there's been a lot of discussion around the Build Canada Homes initiative and emerging federal housing policy. From your perspective, what does this signal about the direction Canada is taking when it comes to housing affordability?
Yeah, and I talked earlier about how the national housing strategy was a big deal, but it didn't really achieve its full potential. And part of that reason was why is because it hasn't been focused on non-market community housing. The single biggest financing envelope under the national housing strategy supports private for-profit rental construction at levels of affordability that are pretty much within what the market is delivering already. So some important things that are a little bit different in what we see with the initial launch of Build Canada Homes. So number one, and this is important, the Prime Minister and the Minister have been really specific. This is primarily about non-market community housing. And I'll quote because I have the webpage in front of me from Build Canada Homes. You know, they are charged with growing the proportion of housing that is non-market, mission-driven, and that produces housing that's affordable for low and middle income households. So we're seeing a greater level of focus on community housing with this initiative. The second thing, the mandate of Build Canada Homes includes creating the conditions for high capacity, growth oriented, non-market housing sector that can scale. So I've had so many conversations with elected officials, with government officials, and I've gotten some insight into their current intentions around Build Canada Homes. And of course, lots can change in between intentions and the actual delivery. But here's my advice for anyone who wants to take advantage of this opportunity. First, don't sit around waiting for a program that you can apply to. Don't wait for an application form on a website and a detailed program application guide like we've seen in the past from CMHC. Those things may never materialize. And I've heard from several government officials, DCH isn't a program. It's a government agency that's looking to invest in non-market community housing. So the second piece of advice follows directly from that. Work up a proposal. So make it something bigger in scale, multiple sites, multiple projects over a multi-year development portfolio. And if you don't have a pipeline of your own projects to fill that portfolio, then team up with other nonprofits, consolidate your development ambitions, work through your municipality, your province, your territory, help them develop a portfolio that also includes your ambitions and your plans. Team up with a private sector builder if you don't have the ability to assemble the capacity locally, but take the initiative. And the third thing, make it prefab, modular, mass timber. There's a significant emphasis for Build Canada Homes on using federal purchasing power to scale up factory-based offsite construction as an industry in Canada. So if you've got a project and you haven't completed the design, build that kind of technology into your project now. And this is a shift, right? This is different from the way we're used to dealing with programs out of CMHC in the past 7 years. And it means that we need to step up as a sector. Build Canada Homes is rolling out quickly. That means it's iterative, it's going to be flexible. They're focused on quick wins right now and very much getting the job done. And as a community housing sector, this means we have to shift from waiting for government to tell us what they will fund to proposing to government where we need their investment so that we can move forward. And CHRA has advocated for a new approach that goes beyond building by building, applications based, prescriptive, sometimes rigid funding. And it looks like we're getting that wish. So we have to step up and we have to be ready for that new approach. And as you have, and as I have, as many people have, I'm sure we've all heard, a lot of criticisms of CMHC. That they're too rigid, they're too risk averse. Not all those criticisms are fair, honestly, like they've performed the mandate the government has given to them. But the government has heard those criticisms too, and they're designing Build Canada Homes to be more flexible, with a different approach to risk. So we need to be ready for that.
I love that. And I'm just going to call out a highlight to the listeners, that I think if you're part of a nonprofit or an organization that wants to be involved in the creation of non-market housing, Ray just shared some great tips back there. So if you zoned out for a sec, you can rewind back quickly. But I think that's some really important thoughts there, Ray. And specifically, I'm thinking of an example for us at Blue Door recently. We had this property that was, only had a single family home, and it had space for much more density. And for years, we were trying to, do we start planning? Okay, well, we don't have the funds. It's kind of a catch 22. But when we made the decision to take on all that risk and do the planning and everything, and, had our shovel ready proposal, then we were able to secure the funds that we needed, which, is tricky. I do hope, like you said, with Build Canada Homes, we'll see the support that nonprofits do desperately need to move the non-market agenda housing forward, because we are tasked with some of the most challenging problems on limited resources.
Yeah.
You were going to say
And
something. Go ahead.
building any kind of housing is hard right now, right? You can see that in the headlines, in newspapers, and it is absolutely true. Building housing that is affordable and accessible to people who aren't served by the market is even harder. And what we gotten used to, where CMHC required projects to be at the shovel ready stage, a class B budget for those who are inside the biz. You're talking about $300,000 or $400,000 of expenses to that stage. One of the opportunities with portfolio-based applications under Build Canada Homes is, you might have something that is approaching shovel ready now. You might have an idea of what the project is after that and two more projects that follow. You can put that into a single portfolio application and include the pre-development funds that you need to hire the architects, the cost accountants and all of those things to work it up to that shovel ready stage. So it gives an applicant more predictability over a longer timeline, to really focus on scaling up their operation. So there's an opportunity there. but we need to work together so we can all take advantage of it in every corner of the country.
Amazing. So, how do you see the balance between market and non-market housing shifting in the years ahead, especially given the growing national focus that you just spoke about on affordability, and maybe tie in homelessness prevention there as well for us?
Yeah, and I made reference earlier to how we need to be looking at systems level change. There was a great report released by the National Housing Council earlier in the fall that provides a it was about coming up with outcomes-based indicators for progress under federal housing programs. It has a great summary of the dynamics at play that have led to the crisis right now, where we're losing so-called naturally occurring affordable housing. So, rents at $1,200 and below in the private market. We're not keeping pace when it comes to building nonprofit and community housing, and the cost of construction, the cost of delivery has gotten so high. But when I open my newspaper, and yeah, like I'm old enough to get a paper newspaper delivered to my door every morning. My eyes are always drawn to stories, in the business section and in the news section about the housing market, housing affordability. What are government leaders saying? What are economists saying? And I keep seeing this fundamental contradiction. I'll see one story about how housing costs are too high. The majority of renters can't afford average asking rent. Young people feel permanently shut out of home ownership. High rents are creating homelessness. We have an affordability crisis. All of these things are true. And then right next to that in the newspaper, there's another story about how we're in a crisis because the condo market has stalled in big cities, how there's an oversupply of high-end rentals, how people can't sell their homes for the same inflated prices anymore, and that this is a crisis. And that version of the crisis, is because rents have leveled off and housing costs have leveled off or even come down a little bit. And this makes no sense, right? Like which is it? Do we need high housing prices, because that's a good thing because they drive economic activity and wealth, or are high housing prices a bad thing because they block economic opportunity and drive poverty? We can't have both of these thoughts going on at the same time. And this is the kind of system breakdown, the dysfunctional housing system that I think we face. We've been relying on this boom bust cycle of residential real estate construction to deliver what's like a basic human right, like adequate housing. And this makes no sense. So we have a housing crisis when costs are rising, and we also have a housing crisis when costs are stalling or dropping, because private for-profit builders are slowing down. So this is a completely dysfunctional system, and we need to rebalance that. And a lot of federal policy over the past decade even has been driven by this trickle down theory of housing supply. That if we just build an extra 3.5 million homes over and above the current pace, that will magically get more affordability. And that simplistic supply and demand thinking just doesn't work in the real world. So private industry can't and won't oversupply the market. So the logic breaks down. And this is what we're seeing right now in a lot of parts of the country, in a lot of big cities. Private developers are slowing down. They're putting projects on the shelf because they can't sell or rent new homes at prices people are actually willing or actually able to pay anymore. And when market prices and rents level off, the system fails and they stop building. So, there's a whole bunch of things that we need to do to correct that, and that includes lowering the cost of development. But to really protect ourselves from that dysfunctional instability, we need to anchor the housing system with a much greater supply of non-market community housing, right? So housing that operates outside of that speculative cycle and isn't subject to the same swings. This is why we're talking about more than doubling the supply of community housing and then working toward 20%.
Do you want to just, for the sake of all our listeners, do you want to just give us a definition of like what community housing is and how does it vary from, other forms of non-market housing, let's say transitional, supportive, etc.
Yeah, so I mean, community housing, and this is the term that the National Housing Strategy really pushed to create the umbrella for any housing that's operated by nonprofits, by co-ops, by public housing agencies, by community land trusts, where the purpose is mission driven rather than profit driven. That can include any range of rents, from deeply affordable rent geared to income to even market value rents, but the revenue and the profit from the rents isn't what's motivating it. It's the quality of the housing that's being provided. This can include housing plus other services like supports and wraparound services to help people live independently or to help people stabilize their lives. But it's the idea that this is housing that operates outside of that profit-driven speculative part of the market. And it's a tiny fraction of the housing system right now. And I acknowledge the majority of the housing is going to be delivered by the private market. And in fact, even when non-market community housing providers are developing new housing, they're hiring for-profit builders and architects and development and construction and engineering companies to do it. But once that housing is built, its purpose is about the mission of affordability, the mission of stability and security of tenure, not about profit.
So then, in the definition you just gave of community housing, that would also encompass transitional and supportive options you mentioned? Okay.
Yeah, I would include anything where someone has a home where the management and ownership of that home is not motivated by profit and speculation, but motivated by a mission around affordability and stability.
And so in all cases, would it need to be subsidized for it to qualify as community housing?
There is a lot of community housing that operates at market rents or near rents. Not the majority, obviously. Most of it is subsidized. And sometimes it's the revenue from those market rents or near market rents that allows the operator to subsidize rents for those who can't otherwise afford it. So mixed income housing is definitely part of the picture, as is deeply affordable and supportive housing.
Thank you. So your team's recently come out with some new research. Can you give us a preview of what this research focuses on and how you hope it will influence housing policy or practice? What have been some of the key findings from that research, and how might it reshape the conversation around housing in Canada?
Yeah, so if we're going to set a target to more than double the supply of community housing in the next decade, we need a measure of where we're at right now and what kind of progress that we've been making. And the National Housing Strategy over the past 7 or 8 years has helped us create a lot of new housing. But where does it fit in terms of the proportion of housing stock? In 2021, 2022, we saw record levels of housing starts in the private market, but we weren't seeing as a proportion the same strength of housing starts in the non-market community sector. So what we did is we hired one of the smartest people working in this field, researcher Steve Pomeroy, to crunch the numbers for us and figure out where we're at right now. And what he discovered, and this report is going to be available by the time this podcast airs on the CHRA website, is that the supply of non-market community housing as a percentage of overall housing peaked in the mid-1990s. That's not a surprise. And we were growing at a fast pace. There were some years before the 1990s where 20% of all housing starts were non-market community housing. We saw the withdrawal of the federal government and their spending power, and things have actually been slowly dropping ever since. So as a percentage of the overall housing supply, we've actually dropped from 5.2% in 1996 to 4.4% in current terms. So the National Housing Strategy has helped us create a lot of new housing, but we've actually fallen behind as a proportion of the overall housing supply. And that's because the National Housing Strategy was not focused on non-market community housing and not focused on where government investment can have the biggest impact on the affordability crisis.
And so for all our listeners to also follow along the math with us, I think you said we should be aiming for 20% of our housing
Absolutely.
stock.
Absolutely. And and we see in a lot of other advanced economies in Europe a much greater supply of non-market community housing, and it acts as a stabilizing force in the housing system. It acts to help keep rent stable across the whole continuum and provides that security of tenure to a bigger proportion of people so that we don't have the insecurity that we see in our current housing system.
Looking ahead, Ray, what gives you hope about the future of community housing in Canada? What role can organizations, policymakers, and the public play in building a more affordable, inclusive housing system right now?
Yeah, and I think we need to keep telling those individual stories of magic where access to a safe, affordable, and secure community housing home has helped someone to turn their life around and to prosper, because that's going to spread the hope, that magic that keeps all of us going in the system. It is really encouraging that there is widespread acknowledgement among elected officials, among policymakers, that 30 years of neglect and non-investment, starting with the federal government, have directly led to this crisis. And I've heard it from Scott Aitchison, the conservative housing critic. I've heard it from three different federal ministers of housing in a row now. Um, so that acknowledgement that we need to increase the share of non-market community housing is really important, and that the kind of work that you do at Blue Door, that so many organizations do across the country, is really at the core of the answer. We know what to do. You and I, in September, went to Helsinki, Finland, to sort of study the work that they've been doing with a supply-based housing first approach that has effectively eliminated chronic homelessness across Finland. And I came back thinking that there was no like massive insight that they do things differently. The same forces that generate homelessness in Canada are generating homelessness in Finland. The same answers to help people get housed that we have in Canada are the same answers they have in Finland. They're just doing it. They're doing more of it, and they're investing actually less money than we are in a dysfunctional system. They saw like a 9-to-1 savings ratio compared to when they didn't have these housing systems in place. The cost of doing nothing is much greater than the cost of acting. And the great opportunity is we know what to do. We just need to do more of it for bigger impact in people's lives and for frankly a better economic impact across the country.
Do you know offhand, like, do we have a calculation of what it would save, like here in Canada? I know the calculations were a bit different in Finland, even the cost of different types of housing, where we would have seen the reverse here in Canada. Do we have an idea of the magnitude of savings we're thinking about?
I sometimes joke that if you took all of the reports that talk about the return on investment and the economic savings of investing in community housing and specifically in supportive housing across the country, whether it's the at-home say SWA study, which is the gold standard, has done studies in BC on investments in Indigenous-led community housing. Um, Dunhouse in Toronto, after a year of operations, is showing incredible numbers of savings to the system from those investments. If you took all of those reports and printed them out on paper, you could probably build several units of affordable housing with all of that paper. We know these answers, and I've seen anything from 9-to-1, 10-to-1 to 3-to-1 savings. Um, One of the challenges in the Canadian context is that federalism makes it hard for the return on investment to land into the right pocket. If a municipality makes an investment in supportive housing, it's the province that saves money in emergency rooms. If the federal government makes an investment in affordable housing, it might be the province that saves money on, the carceral system and the justice system. Actually, all of these things seem to lead to the province saving money. So here's a great reason why provinces and territories need to step up, especially with the wraparound supports that go along with the housing infrastructure. Um, Again, we know what to do. We know the answers. We know the evidence is there. We just need the investment and the support to get it done. And the great news is housers get stuff done.
For sure. Ray, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your insights on where Canada's non-market housing sector is headed. It's clear that the work being done at the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association is vital to shaping a more affordable and equitable housing future for everyone. We'll definitely be keeping an eye out for your upcoming research and the continued progress of initiatives like Build Canada Homes. Thanks so much for being part of the conversation and continuing to lead during this time.
Thanks,
you.
Emmy. It was a pleasure.
Take care, Ray. Thank you for joining us on the show today. That was Ray Sullivan, Executive Director of the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, sharing powerful insights on where Canada's community housing sector is headed. His leadership and advocacy continue to inspire the work that is being done across the country. Thank you to our listeners for joining us on the way home. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, share, and join us next week as we continue exploring the ideas, people, and stories driving housing solutions in Canada. Until next time, I'm Emmy Kelly, and this podcast is brought to you by Blue Door. Thank you.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.